In 1941, Adolf Hitler was left in quite the predicament. The previous year had seen him effectively become master of Europe. The war had spread to Norway, and whilst there was some initial difficulties, these were quickly overcome. In the west, Hitler finally launched his attack against France, and here too the defenders were completely overcome in just a few weeks. The Brits had been sent back across the Channel, and the Führer was proudly proclaiming in private that the war was won. Britain would now surely come to terms and leave Germany alone. In this regard, Hitler could not have been more wrong. Whatever your opinion on Churchill's motives, he was certainly resilient. Hitler was completely deluding himself in thinking that this man would ever surrender, and now the Germans were left with the daunting task of overcoming the Brits. Crossing the Channel was an impossibility that Hitler never took seriously, so he looked into the prospect of shutting the Brits out of the Mediterranean, then maybe they would come to terms. Here too, Hitler was dead wrong. The Spanish, quite rightly, steadfastly refused to join Hitler's war without a mountain of assurances. Pétain's France saw themselves in much the same vein. The Italians invaded Greece on flimsy pretexts, and soon enough they were being pushed back, outnumbered 2-1 by the Greeks in Albania. Immediately afterwards, the Italians in North Africa were folded up by the Brits. Tens of thousands of them were taken prisoner, including several generals. The Brits took just over 100 casualties. The final cherry on the cake was the obvious fact that the USSR was preparing for something big. The biggest troop build-up in human history was occurring on Germany's eastern border. Molotov was invited to Berlin so Hitler could get some clarity, and things were suddenly even clearer. Molotov demanded Danish naval bases on the North Sea, as well as complete control of Finland, Bulgaria, and European Turkey. The Russians were preparing for a great move west, and the Führer had become convinced that he had to hit them first. At the turn of the new year, Hitler felt he was left with no choice. When the right weather came, he would have to save Italy from disaster, and then strike at Russia. A few things before we begin. Firstly, this video is a part of a series on the life of Adolf Hitler. This video can easily be watched on its own, but if you'd like to start from the start, then the link to the playlist is on my channel homepage, or in the description of this video. Secondly, a quick disclaimer. Whilst the topic of Adolf Hitler will always be controversial, that doesn't mean that this video needs to be. This video is entirely a work of history, and not even remotely political. Please don't ever think it. Lastly, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members who make these videos possible. Without their kind support, I simply would not be able to afford to do these videos for a living, and I can't thank them enough. So if you'd like to support the channel, join our Discord, or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, then please do consider clicking one of the links in the description. Thank you. On the 4th of January, Hitler admitted, quote, "The fact is, for better or for worse, Germany is tied to the Duce. In the long run, you can only make history through loyalty." End quote. He had tried offering to mediate between Greece and Italy, but it had been no use. The Germans would have to go through with their plan of intervening in Greece. In regards to the Balkans at large, Hitler saw only Romania as a reliable ally. He said that Antonescu had made the best impression imaginable on him. He saw Bulgaria as loyal but unreliable, as they were so terrified of Russian intervention. Hungary was usable, he said, whilst Yugoslavia was cool, and Hitler was well aware of attempted Allied intrigues in that country at the time. The Balkan explosion had been precisely what Hitler had wanted to avoid for a long time now. First, Italy was threatening Yugoslavia, which was barely avoided. Then, the Soviets were threatening Romania, which again was barely avoided, only due to Romania conceding Bessarabia. Lastly, Italy, for barely coherent reasons, decided to invade Greece, and from that point on, all hope was lost. The Balkans was the worst possible place to be fighting with a modern army, yet now the Germans were left with no choice at all. As for the Russian situation, Hitler made his reasons crystal clear. The Brits were hanging on to Russia as a last hope of victory, and the Russians were clearly receptive judging by their troop build-up and the way they openly talked about smashing Germany. Hitler believed that smashing Russia first would solve both of his problems at once. If Russia was struck down, then the Brits would give up the fight with no damage to her empire, which was always what Hitler had wanted. The imminent Soviet threat would also obviously be dealt with in this way too. It was, in his mind, the only option. He said of Britain and their belief in Russia, quote, "They will only give up when we have smashed this last hope on the continent to smithereens," end quote. In a secret speech in early January, he said of this audacious move, quote, "When we fight this campaign, let Europe hold its breath," end quote. This all lay in the future, however. Right now, there was the crisis in Africa. On the 5th of January, the Italian fortress of Bardia in Libya was captured by the Brits. 45,000 Italians were marched off into captivity, and over 1,000 were killed, whilst the Brits lost just over 100. This was a repeat theme now, and the Italians were in danger of simply just being booted out of North Africa altogether, without even making the tiniest dent in the Brits in the process. The Italians only had 10 divisions left in North Africa. A week later, Hitler went back on his earlier promise to send no support to Africa. A directive was signed ordering the army and Luftwaffe to support Italy. A few days later, Mussolini arrived in shame at the Obersalzberg for a 2-day meeting with Hitler, in which the Duce specifically requested that there be no fuss and no photographs. The two didn't talk about anything out of the ordinary that Hitler hadn't already told his generals in regards to helping Mussolini. The only thing that Hitler left out was the fact that he was planning to invade Russia. The Duce refused Hitler's divisions that he wanted to send to Albania because he needed the Albanian port space himself. However, he sadly agreed to the much-needed help in North Africa. Mussolini's dream of an independent war was dead, and Germany was now in the driving seat. That is, if they could even get there in time. On the 22nd of January, Tobruk fell to the British, and another 25,000 Italian prisoners were taken, with minimal losses on the British side once again. A week or so later, Hitler received a report from his panzer specialist in North Africa, which said that the Italians had no will to resist. Shortly afterwards, the Führer said to his staff, quote, "The crazy feature is that on the one hand, the Italians are shrieking for help, but on the other hand, they are so jealous and childish that they won't stand for being helped by German soldiers. Mussolini would probably like it best if our troops could fight in Italian uniforms there." End quote. Originally, Hitler had just planned to send a blocking force to stop the British advance, but now he was determined to send more in the face of the total Italian collapse. The potential loss of North Africa meant little, he said, but its psychological effect would be absolutely crippling for the Italians. Rommel, a man whom Hitler trusted greatly, was chosen for the task of commanding the Afrika Korps. He would later explain why he was chosen. Quote, "I chose Rommel because he's like Dietl. He knows how to carry his troops forward with him, and this is absolutely vital for the commander of an army fighting under extremes of climate, be it in North Africa or in the far north." End quote. On the 12th of February, the German troops began disembarking in North Africa. There was other matters in the Mediterranean too. Hitler hadn't quite given up on dragging Franco's Spain into the war yet. Franco was extremely evasive. His nation was currently extremely short of food, and even starving in some areas. Just 2 years ago, they'd been in the bloodiest civil war that Western Europe had seen for generations, and now the Germans were expecting him to just jump into the war and hope for the best. In early February, after several no's or evasive answers, Hitler wrote a letter to Franco, saying that at times of crisis, nations could be saved, quote, "less by prudent foresight than by a bold heart," end quote. Safe to say the extremely cautious and planning-obsessed Franco didn't take this bait. On the 14th of February, it was the Yugoslavs' turn. In a 2.5-hour meeting, Hitler had nervously attempted to persuade the Yugoslav Prime Minister to join the Tripartite Pact. The result was inconclusive, but the Yugoslavs promised to talk to the Prince Regent when they got back to Belgrade and let Hitler know. Simultaneously, the planning for the invasion of Russia continued. Irving writes, quote, "Probably no major campaign has ever been launched upon scantier intelligence. The services had furnished their own lower commands with only the most inadequate information on the Russians. Maps were non-existent. The Russian aircraft industry was an unknown quantity, on which the veil was only gradually being lifted. Recent indications were that it was being expanded at a disconcerting speed. Goering was apprehensive that the Russian Air Force might prove more formidable than the army intelligence figures indicated. While Halder had confidently advised the Führer on February the 3rd that they would face only a small Red Army superiority in numbers, 155 divisions, by early April that figure had been raised to 247 divisions. 4 months later, when it was too late to retreat, the army admitted that it had now identified 360 Soviet divisions in combat with them. The whole of Hitler's strategy was based on the assumption that Russia would be laid low in a blitzkrieg of only a few months. Now, on February the 8th, Keitel learned from his staff that while the Luftwaffe and Navy would have enough fuel to last until the coming autumn, gasoline and diesel fuel for the army's tanks and motor transport would not hold out until mid-August, unless of course the oil fields of the Caucasus could be reached in time. End quote. Hitler's theory that if the Soviets were defeated, then the British would accept their defeat too, was probably correct, but the Führer was at this point entirely naive as to the reality of attacking Russia. Despite warnings from his generals not to follow in the footsteps of Napoleon, Hitler continued to do so. The entire plan truly rested on a quick victory. If this were not achieved, then it would mean disaster. Perhaps Hitler felt he had no choice, but either way, he wasn't giving himself much wriggle room if things went wrong. Another aspect of Hitler's thinking could most likely be ascribed simply to his ego. At this point, Hitler was the conqueror of Europe. Any man, but Hitler especially, would be mentally affected by such a conquest. Wherever he was opposed, he had simply prevailed. He must have felt utterly undefeatable. But were the Germans themselves supremely capable, or were their enemies simply incompetent? The economic aspects were completely overlooked too. The supreme overconfidence seemed to completely block off any critical thinking. After meeting with Goering, Keitel's economics expert General Thomas said, quote, "He shares the Führer's opinion that when German troops march into Russia, the entire Bolshevik state will collapse, and that for this reason we need not fear the destruction of the stores and railway system on a large scale, as I do. The main thing is to get rid of the Bolshevik leaders rapidly first of all." End quote. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the military situation began to recover. Rommel had immediately made the difference in North Africa and captured 3,000 Brits, including 5 generals. In Bulgaria too, German troops were flowing into the country, ready for the attack on Greece. Greece was refusing to offer peace terms to Italy at this stage, and German intervention was becoming essentially inevitable. On the 1st of March, the Bulgarian PM was in Vienna with Hitler, and he officially signed his country's entry into the Tripartite Pact. As for Russia, the planning continued. In March, the way the war would be waged was laid out plainly by the army. In the Western campaigns, Hitler had ordered the Wehrmacht to fight with the utmost discipline. Death penalties were to be handed out to those who ignored this order. Meanwhile, in the East, it was an entirely different matter. The Soviet Union had refused to sign the Geneva Convention in 1929, and Soviet methods were by now well known. In the Spanish Civil War, the Soviets had brutally tortured and murdered thousands of innocents and even many fellow communists. In the Soviet half of Poland, the repression was quite the same. Even more recently in the Baltic states, the population had been subjugated to some of the most horrifying repression that Europe had ever known. The Germans knew full well that they would be given no quarter when they fought the Soviets, and Hitler had every intention of fighting fire with fire. As for the repressed people of the Baltics, or other rebellious minorities like the Ukrainians, Heydrich specifically ordered that any pogroms against their, quote, Jewish oppressors were to be actively encouraged. In late March, Hitler made a speech to his army and Luftwaffe generals in which he compared communism to organised criminality. Quote, "We must put the arguments of soldierly comradeship right out of our minds. The communist is no comrade, and never will be." End quote. He went on to explain that Soviet commissars are criminals and must be treated as such. Quote, "I do not expect my generals to understand my orders to this effect, but I demand that they obey them." End quote. That same month, a blow had been struck to Germany, which would reduce her numbers in the east. The British had launched a spectacular lightning raid on the Lofoten Islands in northern Norway. They didn't lose a single man, yet destroyed 3,600 tons of oil and glycerine, captured 228 Germans, found 314 free Norwegian recruits, and captured several Quisling collaborators. Hitler was absolutely livid and ordered that any Norwegians who aided the enemy should be executed. He also decided that he could no longer release 40% of the German military strength in Norway for Operation Barbarossa. For the rest of the war, he would live in fear of a British invasion of Norway, which never came. Meanwhile, another setback occurred in March, as the Italian offensive in Albania, once again, fizzled out. Quote, "The Greek general commanding the Northern Army secretly let the Germans know that he would agree to an immediate armistice in Albania if the Italian troops there were replaced by Germans. They would also talk about territorial claims, provided that there was no Italians at the conference table." Hitler, however, told both Brauchitsch and Raeder that even if Greece would now agree to evict the British, Germany would still have to occupy the whole country so that the Luftwaffe could command the eastern Mediterranean, end quote. AKA, Hitler had no issues with Greece and wanted an end to things there, but because of Italy's other disaster in North Africa, Hitler decided that he had to occupy Greece for their vital airfields. On the 24th of March, Hitler headed off to Vienna to attend the Yugoslavian signing of the Tripartite Pact. The terms that the Yugoslavs had whittled the Germans down to were ridiculous. No Axis troops were allowed to enter Yugoslavia, and she was to make no military contribution herself, but would receive Salonika in Greece as a reward for signing. Even these terms, however, had not been enough for many in the Yugoslavian government. Anti-Italian sentiment was, quite rightly, sky high, and many ministers simply resigned. Once Hitler arrived, he met his sister, Paula. She said to him, quote, "Sometimes when I'm in the mountains and I say a little chapel, I go in and pray for you," end quote. To which Hitler replied, quote, "Do you know it is my absolute conviction that the Lord is holding his protecting hand over me," end quote. The Lord certainly hadn't been protecting him in this instance, however, as a few hundred miles away in Yugoslavia, there was a coup going on. On the 27th, Hitler got the news that Prince Paul had been overthrown. Crowds had swarmed the German legation, the German tourist office had been destroyed, and British flags, distributed by the British legation, were absolutely everywhere. Communists, too, flocked to the streets to sing The Red Flag. The new cabinet refused to ratify the entry into the Tripartite Pact, but, quote, mouthed protestations of loyalty towards Germany, end quote. Hitler, however, rather than being angry, was just glad that this happened now rather than later. Quote, Luckily, the enemy unmasked themselves now, whilst our hands are still free, end quote. Walter Huell wrote in his diary, quote, Goering, Brauchitsch and Ribbentrop are sent for immediately. Decisions are rapidly taken. The mood is exhilarating. The Hungarian and Bulgarian envoys are summoned forthwith, end quote. Meanwhile, Goering's wiretap agency had picked up on a conversation between General Simovic, the head of the coup, and his ambassador in Washington. The two openly discussed their real plans, and the latter had recently spoken to President Roosevelt about them. Hitler told the Hungarian ambassador that now was the time for the Hungarians' revenge. He offered to support every single one of Hungary's territorial claims on Yugoslavia, and he even brought up the crazy prospect of giving Admiral Horthy the port of Fiume, which the admiral, without the coast, must have found very hard to resist. Judging by later events, he went back on this latter idea, however. Right after this, the Bulgarians were offered Macedonia. Hitler exclaimed, quote, The eternal uncertainty down there is over. The tornado is going to burst upon Yugoslavia with breathtaking suddenness, end quote. As for how the attack from the Germans themselves would go, Hitler was clear. This would be nothing like the Western campaigns. This would be a quick, ruthless campaign. The opening move was to bomb Belgrade to pieces with Goering's air force. The Führer said, quote, Politically, it is vital for the blow to fall on Yugoslavia without mercy, end quote. He continued on, quote, Yugoslavia is to be regarded as an enemy, and therefore to be destroyed as rapidly as possible, whatever protestations of loyalty she may momentarily utter, end quote. The Russian campaign, however, was delayed 4 weeks as a result. In the end, though, this turned out to be a positive, as the spring of 1941 brought unusually heavy rains to Central Europe, and the terrain would have been less than ideal for panzer divisions. On the 27th, the same day as he was informed of the coup, Hitler met with the Japanese foreign minister, Yosuke Matsuoka. Certain circles in the Japanese navy were itching to attack Singapore, Britain's key position in the east. Hitler saw nothing but positives from this. Maximum pressure needed to be put on Great Britain to surrender. At best, if successful, this could bring about a change in Britain's attitude to peace. At worst, the move could bring about a protracted Asian war, which would divert Britain's forces so that Germany was facing a weaker enemy. There was, in Hitler's mind, no downsides, and he supported the Japanese move. The previous month, Ribbentrop had cabled his ambassador in Japan, quote, Please use every means at your disposal to get Japan to take Singapore as soon as possible, end quote. There was even a slight hope that the Japanese might attack the Soviets together with the Germans, yet on the foreign minister's way back to Japan, he actually signed an agreement of neutrality in Moscow. On the 30th of March, Hitler met with his generals and once again talked about the necessity of attacking Russia, along with a general overview of the current situation. He lambasted Italy's dreadful performance, but was careful to state that it was the bumbling and devious political and military commanders who were responsible, not the Italian soldiers themselves. In regards to Britain, he stated that they fought on because of her international financial entanglements and the influence of Jews on the government. As for Russia, quote, We have the chance to smash Russia while our own rear is free. That chance will not recur so soon. I would be betraying the future of the German people if I did not seize it now, end quote. In regards to the brutal style of warfare that would be inevitable, he said, quote, In the East, cruelty now will be kindness for the future, end quote. As for the Balkans, the planning continued. It was agreed that Hungary would receive the Banat region, Italy would receive the Dalmatian coast and Montenegro, and Serbia would be put under German military rule. Croatia would be granted extreme autonomy, or essential independence. Bulgaria would get her former lands back. As for the timing, Yugoslavia was now or never. Goering's wiretap agency had picked up the shocking revelation that the new Yugoslavian government was about to sign a pact with Stalin. If this went ahead, the entire thing could blow up in Germany's face. At 1 AM on the 6th of April, Hitler called Goebbels over for some company. In a few hours, the invasion was to begin. The Führer told his propaganda minister that he would prosecute this war against the Serbs without pity. Until 5:20 AM, the two talked. Then, as German bombers headed for Belgrade and his troops crossed the frontier, he headed to bed. 12 days later, Yugoslavia ceased to exist and was partitioned amongst the Axis powers. As for Greece, Irving writes, quote, The British Expeditionary Force found itself fighting a hopeless rearguard action against the German armoured and mountain corps, which had comfortably sidestepped the formidable Metaxas line to pour into Yugoslavia and Greece. The British had committed a real blunder in purchasing the coup d'etat in Belgrade, end quote. The campaign had been ruthless. 17,000 civilians perished in the bombing of Belgrade, and the Yugoslavian armies caved in almost immediately. The Germans lost only 151 dead. 340,000 Yugoslav soldiers were marched off into captivity. Hitler, as an Austrian, had always had a deep resentment against the Serbs. With the Poles in 1939, he lacked the typical Prussian hatred of the Polish people, and thus their cities were spared such bombardments right from the get-go. Here, though, the Serbs were about to enter a seriously rough time. The Greeks were a different matter, though. Hitler loved all things Greek. He was a big admirer of the classics, and he had specifically stated that Athens be spared from bombings due to the city's immense cultural value to the European people. He felt much the same about the Greeks themselves. He ordered that all Greek prisoners were to be released, quote, as a mark of his admiration for the valour with which they defended their frontiers, end quote. The Führer directly told the army that all Greek surrender offers were to be accepted, no matter how small the Greek unit involved was. On the 21st, the Greeks gave in. Quote, Field Marshal List formally accepted the Greek army's surrender on April 21st, even though the Greek commander, General Sokaglu, made it plain that he was not surrendering to the Italians, whom his forces had soundly defeated. Mussolini was livid. Italy, bluttered the Duce, had been fighting with 500,000 men and lost 63,000 dead in her 6 months of war with Greece. Then suddenly the SS lifeguards had advanced so far that they held a bridge which actively blocked the Italian pursuit of the Greeks. Hitler reluctantly backtracked and told Jodl that List was wrong to have accepted the surrender and that the fight must go on until the Greeks surrendered to the Italians too, end quote. The entire ordeal was ridiculous. In a rage, the Italians started a brand new offensive against the Greeks, who were by now preparing to surrender to the Germans, as they had agreed to do. The offensive was comical, however. The Greeks, not even remotely prepared to fight, were inflicting heavy casualties on the Italians, and the Italians were getting nowhere. The Germans quickly rushed for a draft of the surrender terms to Rome. Part of the terms involved letting the Greek officers keep their swords and daggers. On this term, Mussolini went ballistic and refused. The Germans were adamant, however. The Greeks, in their eyes, deserved the best possible treatment because the world had marvelled at their heroic defence, and even counter-offensive against the Italians, pushing them back deep into Albania. Mussolini was forced to concede, but Hitler relented to all of the other ridiculous demands. The Greek and Yugoslav navies, much to raiders' disgust, were given to Italy. Quote, to the fury of both the OKV and the army, Hitler also bowed to Mussolini's demand that the Axis troops stage a ceremonial entry into Athens, with Italians and Germans side by side. The nearest Italians were still a week's march away from Athens, which did not make things easier. At Salonika, the surrender document was signed by all three parties on the afternoon of April the 23rd. After Mussolini had played his final trick on Hitler, the Führer had forbidden premature release of the surrender news, but at 10 a.m. the Italians had already suddenly broadcast it to the world, end quote. Wolfgang Huel, a close confidant of Hitler's, wrote in his diary, quote, the Italians are acting like crazy idiots, end quote. The Italians were causing a headache for Hitler elsewhere too. By now a Croatian state had come into being, with the help of the Germans. General Slavko Kvaternik had seized power in Zagreb, and together he and Ante Pavelić set up a state. Kvaternik was interviewed on the 24th of April, where he was livid about the handing over of Dalmatia to the Italians. Quote, Lahausen found this ancient, upright nationalist's admiration for Germany and her Führer was boundless, but so was his hatred of the Italians, who were now wreaking their revenge on Dalmatia. The Croats are a people of honour, with a long military tradition, complained Kvaternik. And it is bitter beyond words to be trodden down and humiliated by an army that has not been able to pin one victory to its colours. Kvaternik feared that this completely irrational political attitude of the Italians would sow the seeds of serious political danger, end quote. Also on the 24th, Hitler got a letter from Admiral Horthy. In it, the regent of Hungary, not for the first time, suggested that the Germans should attack Russia. He mentioned that Hungary would participate if the whole of Transylvania were promised to him. At the end, he wrote, quote, nobody else knows I have written this letter, and I shall never mention it, even in any memoirs I may write, end quote. On the 25th, Hitler finally told Ribbentrop about his final determination to attack Russia. Ribbentrop later recalled, quote, he said that all the military intelligence reaching him confirmed that the Soviet Union was preparing in a big way along the entire front, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. He was not willing to be taken by surprise once he had recognized the danger. Moscow's pact with the Serbian putschist government was a downright provocation of Germany, and a clear departure from the German-Russian Treaty of Friendship. In this conversation I recommended that he listen first to our ambassador, Count Schulenburg. I wanted to try a diplomatic settlement with Moscow first, but Hitler refused any such attempt, and forbade me to discuss the matter with anybody. No amount of diplomacy could change the Russian attitude, as he now recognized it, but it might rob him of the important tactical element of surprise when he attacked, end quote. Throughout all of these events in March, Stalin had been preparing. Holder was becoming extremely anxious at the gigantic flow of reinforcements pouring towards the German border. Quote, the disposition of Russian forces gives food for thought. If we discount the slogan that the Russians want peace and won't attack anybody themselves, then it has to be admitted that the Russian dispositions could allow them to go over very rapidly from defense into attack, and this could prove highly embarrassing for us, end quote. It was true. All the evidence showed that the Soviet armies were in position to attack, not defend. When they would act was another question entirely, however. When it was almost all over in 1945, Hitler would speak on how he felt at the time. Quote, I didn't take the decision to attack Moscow lightly, but because I knew from certain information that an alliance was being prepared between Britain and Russia, the big question was, should we hit out first or wait until we were overwhelmed at some time in the future?" End quote. On the 5th of May, Stalin would deliver a secret speech to all the Soviet top brass that would prove later historians horribly wrong. The Germans were unaware of the contents of this 40-minute speech. They only knew that it occurred. The contents would only be revealed to them later, when 2 generals and 1 major who were in attendance were captured during the war, and all independently spoke of the speech and its contents. Stalin said, quote, "New tank models, the Mark I and III, are on their way. These are excellent tanks, whose armour can withstand 76mm shells. In the near future, there will also be a new tank graced with my own name. Our war plan is ready. We have built the airfields and the landing grounds, and the frontline aircraft are already there. Everything has been done by way of clearing out the rear areas. All the foreign elements have been removed. It follows that over the next 2 months, we can begin the fight with Germany. We have to take our revenge for Bulgaria and Finland." End quote. He continued on to talk of how the Germans would rapidly run out of their limited supplies and would be swallowed up whole by a carefully prepared partisan movement all over Europe. Later in the night, a general thanked Stalin for preserving the peace of Europe. Stalin waved for him to stop and then made a second speech. Quote, "During the years of the capitalist encirclement of the Soviet Union, we were able to make good use of the peace-loving slogan, while we expanded the Soviet Union's frontiers to the north and west. But now we must discard this slogan for the reactionary and narrow-minded slogan that it is, as it will not serve us to win 1 more square inch of territory. It is time to stop chewing that particular cud, Comrade Chosin. Stop being a simpleton. The era of forcible expansion has begun for the Soviet Union." End quote. He then raised his glass and shouted, quote, "Long live the active policy of aggression of the Soviet nation." End quote. As things stood in early May, Hitler was the complete master of Europe. The Brits had been completely expelled from the Greek mainland, and there wasn't any more nations for Churchill to drag into the war. Despite all this, Hitler wasn't happy. He would complain bitterly of his useless Italian allies to Goebbels at the time, quote, "Without them, Pétain would have stayed at our side, Franco might have joined us after all, and Gibraltar would be in our hands. Then Turkey would have been wide open to offers too." End quote. On the 11th of May, his position got worse. Rudolf Hess's adjutant, Karl-Heinz Pinch, burst into the room and gave Hitler a letter. He quickly read it and then sunk into a chair in disbelief before shouting, quote, "Oh my God, he has flown to Britain." End quote. The previous day, a package had arrived from Hess, but Hitler had pushed it to one side. Now, however, he chose to open it. Inside was a long-winded account of his motives. He explained that he was going to fly to Britain to deliver a peace plan, and he promised that he wouldn't tell the British about Operation Barbarossa, no matter what. Hitler went absolutely ballistic. He had expressly told the Luftwaffe that Hess was not to fly under any circumstances, as he didn't want to risk his deputy's life. But now he was not only flying, but had literally flown into enemy territory, most likely never to return. Goering was immediately called over and got the full force of a Hitler meltdown. Pinch, who had delivered the news, was immediately arrested and led away. He would only be released in 1944 to serve on the Eastern Front. He was then captured by the Soviets, his identity was betrayed and his fingers were all broken so he would confess to whatever they wanted, and he was unable to use a knife and fork again. He would only be released in 1955. Meanwhile, Hitler's rant continued. Hitler would say to Julius Schwab, quote, "If Hess really gets there, just imagine. Churchill has Hess in his grasp. What lunacy on Hess's part. They will give Hess some drug or other to make him stand before a microphone and broadcast whatever Churchill wants." End quote. In a sense, he was right. The British used all sorts of techniques and drugs to make Hess talk, but he never did. Instead, he tried to kill himself in order to not betray any information. When this failed, he slowly lost his mind and was never the same again. He would serve the rest of his life in Allied captivity as a broken man until he was murdered by an African-American guard at Spandau Prison in 1987, aged 93. Regardless, in 1941, Hitler's next few days were spent in intense worry about Hess. No one was sure if he had arrived or not, and most just wished he'd crashed into the North Sea. The greatest fear was that the British would take Hess's offer as an official peace offer and broadcast it to the world in order to discredit the Germans in front of their allies. In order to prevent this, Hitler had to embarrassingly announce that Hess was a madman who had fallen under the influence of mystics, astrologers, and nature healers. Perhaps the biggest change from Hess's flight wasn't the disappearance of Hess himself, who was by now pretty much a non-entity in the Nazi hierarchy, but the man chosen to replace him. Martin Bormann was essentially a soulless man who cared only for power. Bormann immediately tried to have everyone connected to Hess locked up. Hitler himself had to intervene on behalf of Ilse Hess, Rudolf's completely innocent wife. Bormann even went to the extent of rechristening his own children. They were formerly called Rudolf and Ilse. Every trace of Rudolf Hess was immediately to be expunged from party history. It was to be as if Rudolf never existed. Now it was Bormann's time. A year later, another party man fell prey to the same delusions as Hess. Karl Rover, Gauleiter of Oldenburg, was getting visits from faith healers and was beginning to suggest that he should fly to meet Churchill. 2 days after hearing of this, Bormann had him killed. Hess had been an absolute pacifist, adored by all in the party. He flew away due to being tormented by nightmares of dead British and German children. Now he was being replaced by the most ruthless man in the party, and now the party, and the state at large, would enter a new, darker chapter. On the 12th of May, Hitler formally replaced Hess's old Office of the Deputy Führer with a party chancellery, headed by Bormann. Irving explains how Bormann essentially now ran the nation at length. Quote, Bormann now gathered powers the like of which Hess had never had, but Hitler begrudged this hard-working, unobtrusive, ruthless manager none of them. Secretary Christa Schroeder overheard him command Bormann, "Just keep the Gauleiters off my back." And the 40-year-old Bormann, who in 1930 had founded the party's financial fortunes by an insurance scheme under which millions of SA street fighters had paid 30 pfennigs a month and stuck stamps onto a yellow card, did just that. In alliance with the crafty constitutional expert Dr. Hans Lammers, Bormann established a civilian bottleneck through which all state affairs now had to pass on their way up to Hitler. Hitler's whim, no sooner spoken, was noted down by Bormann, elaborated by the lawyers on his staff, and circulated by party channels and teleprinters almost instantly as a Führer command. From now on, Bormann increasingly ran the Reich, whilst Hitler directed the war. Bormann achieved that most dangerous of attributes, indispensability. Hitler ignored the man's boorishness. Bormann's one and only public speech at a Gauleiter conference was a fiasco. Privately, Hitler could never forgive him for what he and the party had done to his Obersalzberg. The Berghof was ringed by more and more buildings and construction sites and bunkers. He even mentioned to Schwab that he was thinking of moving his permanent residence to Linz or Beirut because of this. Hitler also disagreed with Bormann's brutal approach to dealing with the church and Jews. Yet Bormann survived until the end, dreaming of the day when he might step into the Führer's shoes. Bormann clung to him like ivy around the oak, Robert Ley was to say, urging him to get to the light and to the very summit, end quote. Regardless of the Hess situation, Hitler had bigger problems, and perhaps that's why he handled the Hess situation so carelessly. In the East, there was a war to plan, and that's all Hitler really cared about for the rest of his life. As Irving said, Bormann now ran the Reich. Hitler ran the war. During May, it was time to approach potential allies in this crusade against Soviet Russia. First up, it was Finland. Finland had taken heavy casualties during the Winter War, but the Germans knew full well they would be thirsting for revenge. Due to the losses from before, however, they were willing to let the Finns participate as much or as little as they saw fit. The Romanians were desperate for their own revenge over Bessarabia, and General Antonescu was the best ally Hitler could hope to have. There was no doubt over Romanian participation. Another problem gnawed away at the Führer. The USA was neutral on paper, but President Roosevelt made it abundantly clear that he wanted to join the war, and was constantly pushing lies to swing Americans from isolationism to interventionism. An interview was arranged between Hitler and John Cudahy, the former American ambassador to Belgium, in order to get Hitler's views in the American press. Quote, right at the start he tried to put out of his visitor's mind the ludicrous notion that the Nazis might ever invade the Americas. This was just a wicked lie invented to convert American public opinion, said Hitler. Indeed, he laughed out loud, dismissed it as a childish suggestion, and exclaimed, that is on a level with claiming that America plans to conquer the moon, end quote. Wolfgang Huell wrote after the interview, quote, questions from another world, childish, like in the years of struggle 20 years ago, but positive, Cudahy deeply impressed, end quote. Meanwhile, orders were given to the German Navy to behave absolutely perfectly at the Atlantic, so as to not allow Roosevelt to get his excuse for war. Huell wrote about Hitler's attitude, quote, it is better to keep the USA out of the war than perhaps to sink a few 100,000 tons more shipping. Without the USA, the war will be over this year. With the USA, it will go on for years to come, end quote. Elsewhere, there was mixed news. The Bismarck had set off on a raiding mission, which Hitler had always felt uneasy about. The result was that it did plenty of damage, but the unsinkable Bismarck herself was ruined and then scuttled with heavy loss of life. The ordeal did, however, draw away the Royal Navy during the vital invasion of Crete, which was successful, albeit with heavy losses to Goering's paratroopers. Control of Crete severely reduced the British presence in the eastern Mediterranean and allowed Rommel to work his magic. After the sinking of the Bismarck, however, Hitler expressly forbid any surface ships to put to sea ever again without his express permission. Things were also going badly in the Middle East. Hitler had offered tacit support to an Iraqi coup, but the British were now marching on Baghdad. Hitler was never really that invested, but Mussolini was. He sent word to Hitler, quote, "I, Mussolini, am in favour of active support, as this is an opportunity to raise the entire population of the Middle East against Britain. But if Iraq collapses, they will all lose heart again. If the German High Command also decides on active support, then it seems to me necessary to occupy Cyprus as well, after the reduction of Crete and Rhodes, since it lies off the Syrian coastline and holds the key to the entire Middle East." End quote. Hitler could only laugh at Mussolini acting so above his station in response. Huell recorded Hitler as saying, quote, "Mussolini thinks Cyprus should be taken now as well. The Führer proposes to agree, and to tell him to do it himself." End quote. Huell also recorded Hitler's remarks at a conference for the OKV on the 29th of May. Quote, "The point under debate is how far to bring in France or to get her involved in a war with Britain. The Führer curses the Italians. He hates the Spanish. Of Italy, he says that you can't keep making concessions to somebody who is always running around with his backside black and blue from beatings. Nor will the German people stand for it. The Führer's view is that when Barbarossa is over, he won't need to pay any more attention to Italy. We shall then automatically be able to come together with the French. They are counting on kicking the Italians out of Tunisia after the war. He wants to have a talk with Mussolini shortly." End quote. Later that day, Hitler said to Huell, quote, "Barbarossa is a gamble like everything else. If it fails, then it will all be over anyway. If it succeeds, it will have created a situation that will probably force Britain to make peace. When the first shot is fired, the world will hold its breath." End quote. In early June, the old world was nearing its end. The events of later that month would change the world forever. By now, the coalition was formed. Mussolini was only giving hints of what was to come, yet Finland and Romania, by far the two most important allies on the Eastern Front, were enthusiastically preparing for what they called the historic hour. It was in early June that Hitler gave his infamous Commissar order. All Soviet commissars, whom also happened to be overwhelmingly Jewish, were to be executed immediately upon capture. Hitler said they were, quote, "originators of these barbaric Asiatic fighting methods. If they are caught fighting or offering resistance, they are to be shot out of hand without exception and immediately." End quote. Another instruction was proposed by General Halder, which read, quote, "Immediate collective punishments will be enforced against towns and villages from which ambushes or treacherous attacks on the Wehrmacht are made, on the orders of an officer of not less than battalion commander's rank, if circumstances do not permit the rapid arrest of the individual perpetrators." End quote. Essentially, offences against Soviet civilians were now simply not punishable. Partisans were to be shot regardless of the circumstances, and the Red Army itself was to be treated in a brutal fashion, owing to them not having signed the Geneva Convention. Almost immediately, Hitler's harsh stance would be seen as inevitable, as in just the first few days, countless German soldiers had been found mutilated beyond description by their captors. Many had been fed their own genitals while still alive, or undergone other such Stone Age barbarity. Huell wrote of Hitler's thoughts on the 8th of June, quote, "The British are marching into Syria. A long conversation alone with the Führer about Russia. Says it will be a tough proposition, but he trusts in the Wehrmacht. Air Force, numerical superiority in fighters and bombers. He is a bit frightened of air raids on Berlin and Vienna." End quote. He continues on to quote Hitler, quote, "The area we are to occupy will not be much bigger than from Denmark to Bordeaux in size. The Russians have massed their entire strength on their western frontier, the biggest concentration in history. If Barbarossa goes wrong now, we are all lost anyway. As soon as that is all over, Iraq and Syria will take care of themselves. Then I will have a free hand, and I will be able to thrust on down through Turkey as well. If the French lose Syria, and I am convinced that Syria is lost, then there is only one danger left, that they will lose Algeria as well. If that happens, I will thrust straight down through Spain at once and barricade the Mediterranean against the British. It is just this wretched waiting that makes one so nervous." End quote. With days to go before the beginning of Barbarossa, the Führer began to write up his Barbarossa proclamation. He wrote of how he had never wished ill upon the Russian people themselves, but he said, quote, "But for 2 decades the Jewish Bolshevik rulers of Moscow have endeavoured to set not only Germany, but all Europe alight." End quote. He continued on to explain that Germany had never planned to export Nazi ideology to Russia, the same way Russia had tried to export Soviet ideology to the world. The proclamation, which would be announced on the day of the invasion, ended, quote, "At this moment, soldiers of the Eastern Front, an assembly of strength the like of which in size and scale the world has never seen, is now complete. In league with Finnish divisions, our comrades are standing with the victor of Narvik on the shores of the Arctic in the north, German soldiers under the command of the conqueror of Norway, and the Finnish heroes of freedom under their own marshal are protecting Finland. On the Eastern Front stand you. In Romania, on the banks of the Prut and along the Danube right down to the beaches of the Black Sea, are German and Romanian troops, united under Antonescu, the head of state. When this, the greatest frontline in history, now begins its advance, it will do so not just to provide the means of ending this great war for all time, or to defend these countries currently involved, but for the salvation of our entire European civilization and culture. German soldiers, you are thus entering upon a harsh and demanding fight, because the fate of Europe, the future of the German Reich, the existence of our nation, now rests in your hands alone. May the Lord God help us all in this struggle." End quote. Huell wrote of Hitler's feelings as the days ticked down towards the invasion. Quote, "A long conversation with the Führer, wishes he were 10 weeks on from now. After all, there must always be a big element of risk. We are standing outside a locked door. Will we run into secret weapons? The tenacity of the fanatic. He now has to take sleeping pills to fall asleep. He is still dictating. He told me that this morning he again pored over every minute detail but found no possibility for the enemy to get the better of Germany. He thinks Britain will have to give in, and he hopes it will be before the year is over." End quote. This issue would plague Hitler for days to come. The Germans had very limited intelligence about the Soviet Union. Most of the world had no idea what was going on in that strange country. Indeed, days after the invasion, the Germans were permitted by their protecting power, the Swedes, to search the Soviet embassy in Paris. When they entered, they found that the staff had locked themselves behind heavily armoured plate doors, where they were burning documents and other materials in specially made furnaces. When the whole ordeal was over and done with, they found a huge haul of radio gear, time fuses, detonators and explosives. The most horrifying thing of all, however, was the furnaces. The furnaces weren't for burning documents. They were built for cremating bodies. Admiral Canaris reported, quote, "The completely isolated wing of the embassy in which the GPU's offices and execution chambers were located can only be described as a criminal's and a murderer's workshop of the most outstanding technical perfection. Soundproof walls, heavy electrical operated steel doors, hidden spy holes and slots for guns to be fired from one room into another. An electrical furnace and a bathtub in which corpses were cut up completed the macabre inventory of these rooms, in addition to housebreaking implements, poison capsules and the like. Thus there is every probability that many an awkward white Russian emigre or opponent of the Soviets in France vanished in this way. They literally went up in smoke." End quote. Hitler immediately ordered the Soviet embassy buildings in Berlin searched, and the exact same things were found. Furnaces, guns, ammunition and all. The Germans weren't fighting a nation state. They were up against something else entirely, which was far, far more ominous. Regardless, Hitler felt he had no choice. At 3:30 am on the 22nd of June, 3 million German and coalition troops knocked down the door into the unknown abyss. Hitler, for his part, retired to bed after staying up with Goebbels. He remarked to his adjutants before sleeping, quote, "Before 3 months have passed, we shall witness a collapse in Russia, the like of which world history has never seen." End quote. Upon awaking, Hitler was bombarded with messages from his allies. A delighted Admiral Horthy of Hungary said to the German ambassador that he had dreamed of this day for 20 years. Mankind would thank Hitler for centuries to come, he said. Horthy, however, was playing a double game. He was evasive and broke off relations with the Soviets, but that was as far as he would go. He then went off to Polo in order to ignore the Germans who were wishing to speak with him. Horthy wanted to see the results of Barbarossa before throwing his hat in the ring. Elsewhere, however, there were willing reinforcements. In Spain, Francisco Franco was immediately offering up as many troops as would be needed in a volunteer legion. Franco had seen his nation ravaged by communist terror, and now he was itching for his revenge. Almost immediately, thousands of deeply Catholic Spaniards signed up to head off to war against the atheistic Soviet Union. In their mind, this was as much of a crusade as any other in Christianity's long history. In Russia itself, the surprise was complete. The Russian Air Force had been close to the border on their newly constructed airfields, ready for the invasion of Germany. Instead, they were caught on the defensive and obliterated on the ground. On the very first day, 1,200 aircraft were destroyed. The same was true of the infantry and the tanks. By the end of July, 12,000 Soviet tanks had been captured or destroyed. A seemingly endless horde of Soviet troops had been right up against the border, ready for the great offensive into Germany to spread communism across Europe. Instead, they were quickly encircled and absolutely destroyed. Hitler was overjoyed. Huell reported on the 23rd, quote, "The Führer is in a brilliant mood on account of the huge successes in Russia," end quote. That same day, Hitler headed off east to his secret headquarters, which had been under construction for months in East Prussia. On the train ride there, he chose to name it the Wolf's Lair. Christa Schroeder, his secretary, asked him why he had chosen Wolf again, to which the Führer replied, quote, "That was my code name in the years of struggle," end quote. Despite the initial success, there were problems. The Soviet Air Force was far bigger than initially anticipated. The same was the case for Soviet armor. There seemed to be an unlimited amount of Soviet soldiers too. Frederick the Great, Hitler's hero, once said, quote, "You've got to shoot every Russian dead twice, and still turn him over to make sure," end quote. His words were proving true. There was millions upon millions of them. Chief of Staff Halder wrote on the 16th of July, quote, "The Russians drive their men forward into counterattacks without the least artillery support. As many as 12 waves, one after another. Often they are raw recruits who just link arms, and their muskets on their backs, charge our machine guns, driven by their terror of the commissars and their superiors. Sheer weight of numbers has always been Russia's forte, and now the Russian command is forcing us to slay them, because stand aside, they won't," end quote. Already on the 27th of June, Hitler was having second thoughts. He said to Ribbentrop, quote, "If I had had the slightest inkling of this gigantic Red Army assemblage, I would never have taken the decision to attack," end quote. Meanwhile, Stalin too was panicking. On the 28th, he dictated a secret memorandum recommending that the departing German ambassador be contacted so that the Soviets could sue for peace and offer Hitler a new Brest-Litovsk-style peace treaty so that Germany would gain the Baltic states and Ukraine. As for the Ukrainians, they were greeting the advancing Germans warmly. With sour memories of the Holodomor still fresh in their minds, the Ukrainians essentially threw themselves on the advancing German soldiers. General Guderian would write in a letter on the 29th of June, quote, "Today there is a Thanksgiving service in the local Orthodox churches, as we are regarded as liberators. I hope they don't get let down," end quote. The same was the case to a lesser extent in modern-day Belarus. 2 days later, Guderian wrote, quote, "The first Russian villages, we were in Poland until now, make a pretty dismal impression. The inhabitants, white Ruthenians, are friendly enough and don't care much of the Soviets' collapse. But there are some who think differently, especially amongst the troops, and they're putting up a stiff and courageous fight," end quote. The rout continued. On July the 2nd, Hitler was shown a decoded Turkish report, which quoted both Stalin and Marshal Timoshenko as conceding to foreign diplomats that they had written off Leningrad, Minsk, Kiev, and Moscow. A decoded American report from Moscow also revealed that the Soviets were preparing to send their gold reserves east. It appeared as if the collapse was total. General Halder and others were already boasting that the war had already essentially been won. By now, the doubters had joined in. Hungary was attacked by Russian aircraft and joined the war. Slovakia enthusiastically signed up. They too saw this in much the same vein as the Spaniards, a Christian struggle against Jewish-led atheistic Bolshevism. Meanwhile, more support came pouring in. The French government broke off diplomatic relations with the USSR, and thousands of patriotic Frenchmen joined their Spanish co-religionists in signing up for a grand crusade. 150 French airmen even volunteered, including 20 of France's most prolific bomber pilots. Meanwhile, legions were already beginning to take shape in Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and Croatia. It was as if all of continental Europe had united beneath one banner as never before since the Crusades for the Holy Land. As if to prove the point, the Vatican enthusiastically said that they welcomed the war with Russia. Hitler chose the SS to handle the volunteers from the Germanic countries, whilst the Wehrmacht were to handle the rest. Only Sweden and Switzerland offered up very little official support. Hitler called them, quote, "nations on furlough," end quote. On the 10th of July, Huell wrote of Hitler in his diary regarding this topic, quote, "He predicted it. He believes that Churchill will topple all at once quite suddenly. Then in Britain, an immense anti-Americanism will arise, and Britain will be the first country to join the ranks of Europe in the fight against America. He is infinitely confident of victory. The tasks confronting him today are as nothing," he says, "compared with those in the years of struggle, particularly since ours is the biggest and finest army in the world," end quote. This confidence was beginning to have its downsides, however. On the 8th, Hitler instructed General Brauchitsch not to send new tanks to the Eastern Front. The panzer divisions there were to be reduced in number, and idle tank crews were to be sent back west. The war, in his eyes, was already won. He wasn't so much thinking of the war as of now, but was dreaming of the future already. He would constantly throw out remarks about what he would do after the war, as opposed to how to win the current one. On one occasion, he was heard to brag, quote, "Mr. Chamberlain likes to take weekends in the country. I shall take countries in the weekend," end quote. Meanwhile, on the ground, others were in disbelief. General Jeschenek's deputy wrote on the 15th of July, quote, "The Red Army's equipment staggers us again and again. They had laid out enormous fortifications, mostly still incomplete, to guard their Lemberg salient. In this region, 63 huge airfields alone, each with 2 runways and all still incomplete, bear witness to the Russian attack preparations," end quote. Meanwhile, in late July, Hitler fell ill. The Wolf's Lair was located in malarial swampland, and he was, after all, under more stress than perhaps almost anyone in history. The Führer was now stuck there with dysentery. Hitler's ability to dictate strategy now receded with his health. Hitler wanted a huge enveloping movement around Moscow to take place from Army Group North and South. General Brauchitsch, however, favoured a direct assault on Moscow by Army Group Center. Soon enough, Hitler began to blame them for everything, and proclaimed to Brauchitsch that if things carried on as they were, then the front would inevitably become static, like in the Great War. In early August, the illness got worse. Hitler stated that he had intense pains in his left temple, and that his ears were ringing horribly. The doctor found him deathly white, and unable to even extend his hands without them trembling. Day after day, Hitler would find himself unable to leave his bed without the most extreme efforts. He was absolutely livid. He just wanted to get on with the war. By the 11th of August, Hitler even ended up having to get his doctor to apply leeches to lower his blood pressure. Afterwards, Hitler ended up bleeding for 2 hours, and Morel, his doctor, had to apply bandages. He skipped dinner that evening on account of how ridiculous he looked. In the end though, they actually worked, and at least the ringing in his ears stopped. He was able to attend the war conference and tea session afterwards as normal that evening. There was worse news though. When Hitler's results returned to the doctor, it appeared clear that the Führer was suffering from a virtually incurable heart disease. Dr. Morel decided to keep this news from his patient. As for the battle itself, Hitler had insisted that the entire attack be directed southwards. He wanted to deprive Stalin of his raw materials in Ukraine. On top of this, the Soviets were using Crimean air bases to bomb Romania. This was such a thorn in Hitler's side that he was having a recurring nightmare in which the Ploiest oil fields were on fire from end to end. The generals protested as they simply would not be able to reach Moscow if they were diverted now. They also complained that their tanks were in need of an overhaul, which was true. Hitler just dismissed these remarks as nonsense and said that they said the same thing at Dunkirk. The army chose to disregard this and push on towards Moscow in what ended up being a confused double strategy. Also in August, Hitler had problems at home. The Bishop of Munster, Count von Galen, had blown the lid off the Nazi euthanasia program. The law of 1939 had never been officially published, and now the people knew full well what was going on, and they were horrified. Catholics especially threw an absolute fit about this brazen murder scheme. Bühler had told Hitler in January that he had already killed 80,000 and that there was 60,000 more to go. Bormann, in typical Bormann fashion, wrote a memorandum to Hitler stating that the bishop should be executed for revealing the program. Hitler, however, waved off this ridiculous suggestion and immediately caved into the demands of overwhelmingly Christian Germany. On the 24th of August, he gave the official order to shut down the euthanasia operation. Meanwhile, in the background, unbeknownst to Hitler, Martin Bormann was waging open warfare on the church. Leaving Bormann in charge at home had already become a disaster. Hitler said on one occasion when asked his opinion, quote, "If my mother was still alive, she'd definitely be a churchgoer, and I wouldn't want to hinder her. On the contrary, you've got to respect the faith of the people." End quote. On the 30th of July, Hitler made Bormann publish a circular to all the Gauleiters, stating that they were absolutely not to persecute any Christian communities for any reason at all. On the 18th of August, Goebbels went for a 4-hour talk with Hitler, in which Hitler spoke of his current thoughts on the war. Quote, "The Führer is not concerned with occupying particular regions or cities. He wants to avoid casualties, if at all possible. Therefore, he does not intend to take Petersburg or Kiev by force of arms, but to starve them into submission. Once Petersburg has been cut off, his plan is to destroy the city's lifeline with his Luftwaffe and artillery. Our first Luftwaffe attacks will hit the water, power and gas plants." End quote. The Führer continued on to suggest that Stalin might even make peace. He also spoke of the findings of his troops, which vindicated his decision to invade in the first place. He told Goebbels about how the Russians were found to have better large-scale maps of Germany and Austria than they had themselves. The Russians had also completed many unpublished highways towards the German frontier, which the Germans themselves didn't even know about. The Russians, however, could use these modern roads to full effect, whilst the Germans used the only roads they knew. Inside of various Red Army barracks, they found German dummy soldiers had been used for target practice, long before June 1941. Hitler's commanders all agreed now that he was absolutely correct in striking first. Bock, Kluge and Holder, just to name a few, had recently agreed that Hitler chose the exact right time to strike. On the 25th of August, Mussolini arrived at the Wolf's Lair. Huell jotted down, quote, "War conference, then a communal meal in the dining bunker and a talk with my chief. In the evening a cold buffet in the garden. Vittorio Mussolini is particularly unattractive and dumb." End quote. The next day, Hitler took Mussolini to the battlefield at Brest-Litovsk. That evening, they then headed to Hitler's southern headquarters in Galicia, where Mussolini began to pour his heart out about conditions in Italy. Hitler would later quote Mussolini as saying, quote, "Tell me, what can you do if you've got officers with reservations about the regime and about its ideologies, who say, the moment you talk of your ideology, or raison d'etat, we are monarchists, we owe our allegiance to the king," end quote. Hitler never forgot Mussolini's weakness, and couldn't believe he was so impotent against the weak Italian king, whom Hitler had such a low opinion of. Italy was only a year into the war, and already in a comical state. Regardless, the duo then headed off to von Rundstedt's command post in Ukraine. Hitler would later describe his impressions of the place, quote, I must have seen thousands of women there, but not one of them was wearing even the cheapest ornaments. In their wretched hovels, there was neither cutlery nor other household goods, and this misery prevailed in a region whose soil was capable of the biggest harvest imaginable. Only when this terrified, scared mass of people saw with their own eyes the commissars being shot did they gradually turn back into human beings again." End quote. Another interesting recollection of Hitler's thoughts at the time is from Puttkamer, his naval adjutant. He wrote that France was seemingly extremely open to joining the German side of the war. He believed that Admiral Darlan, the Prime Minister of France, was genuine. There was one thing stopping this huge move that would have turned the tide of the war, and indeed, history, forever. Quote, "The decisive obstacle is, however, Italy's claims, Tunis and Corsica. No French government could uphold these. But he couldn't persuade the Italians to drop them. He had to associate himself with these claims too. He couldn't barter our ally Italy against France, he said. So that's the real reason, which was news to both me and Jodl, with whom I discussed it." End quote. On the 8th of September, Hitler spoke further on the topic of alliances. In reference to Hungary, he said, quote, "These are all just alliances of expediency. For example, the German people know that our alliance with Italy is only an alliance between Mussolini and myself. We Germans have sympathy only with Finland. We could find some sympathy with Sweden, and of course, with Britain. A German-British alliance would be an alliance from people to people. The British would only have to keep their hands off the continent. They could keep their empire, and the world if they wanted." End quote. On the 10th, we find Hitler commanding his troops to starve out Leningrad. Quote, "The Führer wants to avoid house-to-house fighting, which would cost our troops heavy casualties. The city is to be just shut in, shot to pieces by artillery, and starved out. A few days or weeks here or there make no difference as the besieging army won't have to be very big." End quote. At 5:30 on the 2nd of October, the last act of Barbarossa had begun, or at least that was how Hitler imagined it. 2,000 tanks began the great push towards Moscow, otherwise known as Operation Typhoon. During lunch that day, Hitler was unusually quiet, and only spoke to inquire about the weather or to reminisce over the Berghof, his favourite place on Earth. He would often complain at how Bormann was destroying the place with his various construction projects. Hitler was being hopeful, asking about the weather, as everyone knew full well what was to come. A month prior, on the 14th of August, Checheniek's deputy had said, quote, "It's all getting very late. At the end of October, the war will die out in the snow." End quote. On the 3rd, the homesick Hitler returned to Berlin. He was just glad to be out of the monotony of bunker life, which had been negatively affecting his health so much. Upon his arrival, he was enthusiastically greeted by the Berliners. Hitler would say, quote, "It was the same atmosphere as the most wonderful of our meetings during the years of struggle. The reason was that no special tickets had been distributed. The audience really was a cross-section of the people. The ordinary people really do make the most appreciative audience. They are the people who deep down inside know they support me. They are marked by that kind of stability that can stand the heaviest burdens, while our intellectuals just flutter hither and thither." End quote. At the Sportspalast, he delivered a speech to his people in which he spoke of how Italy, Hungary, the Nordic countries, and then Japan had come closer to Germany. He continued on, quote, "Unhappily, however, the nation I have courted all my life, the British, not that the British people as a whole alone bear the responsibility for this, no, but there are some people who in their pig-headed hatred and lunacy have sabotaged every such attempt at an understanding between us, with the support of that international enemy known to us all, international Jewry. As in all the years I strove to achieve understanding, whatever the cost, there was Mr. Churchill, who kept on shouting, 'I want war.' Now he has it." End quote. Almost an hour later, Hitler's train was already taking him back to his headquarters near the front, where victory seemed to be imminent. Another almost 700,000 Soviet prisoners had been taken at Vyazma and Bryansk alone. Suddenly, Hitler spoke freely again. He was extremely talkative at mealtimes, and it seemed as if all his fears had been wiped away by the initial success. On the 8th, Jodl was proudly proclaiming, quote, "We have finally, and without exaggeration, won this war." End quote. Meanwhile, it was beginning to rain. On the 7th, the first bit of snow landed on top of Hitler's headquarters. Guderian wrote, quote, "The weather gods have made monkeys out of us. First rain, then blizzards yesterday morning. Frost in the afternoon and at night, and thawing again today. The roads are bottomless, and our progress is suffering." End quote. The infamous disaster was beginning to take shape, and Guderian began to have his doubts. On the 11th, he wrote, quote, "We think we've now destroyed the bulk of the Russian army. What's left can't be much good. We mustn't count our chickens. War often produces ugly surprises." End quote. By the 16th of October, there was 6 inches of snow covering the entire countryside. Within days, the push on Moscow was paralysed, and the front line barely moved. On the 15th, Guderian had written, quote, Our troops don't have winter clothing yet, and there's no antifreeze for the motor transport. The horses have no stables." End quote. Hitler had been pestering the army to sort out the troops' winter needs for weeks now, yet the army seemed to be completely half-arsed about it. Now the troops were freezing and working with extremely overstretched supply lines. The Russians, however, had ripped up every rail track, or essentially anything else of importance, during the retreat. This, combined with the sludge and the snow, resulted in an absolute disaster for logistics. Meanwhile, the Soviets were fighting just a few miles away from the gigantic armaments facilities in Moscow. Regardless of the ominous signs, Hitler urged his men on to greater and greater triumphs, like a gambler who refuses to cash in on his gains before the impending collapse. Privately, however, Hitler was admitting that he would accept a general settlement with Britain, even if it meant not occupying any more land. Admiral Frick reported, quote, "The Führer would be glad for Britain, once the Eastern Campaign is over, to show signs of common sense, even if it meant that Germany could not win further ground than she already occupies." End quote. Talking of Britain, there was trouble elsewhere, now that all the focus had been switched to the east. Rommel was having his own supply nightmare, and Hitler bitterly complained that he hadn't been kept up to date on the worsening situation by the army. This simply wasn't true, however, and ever since July, Admiral Raeder had been preaching that the Luftwaffe needed to do more to protect the supply lines in North Africa. Hitler began rapidly promising Mussolini that Goering's Luftwaffe would take action. Admiral Frick argued that the Italians should just sort this out themselves, as this was, after all, their theatre of war, and the Germans were just lending support. Hitler, however, disagreed, and knew full well how utterly ineffective the Italians were. Hitler explained that, quote, "Any change of government in Italy would spell the end of the fascist regime, and Italy would unquestionably cross into the enemy camp." End quote. In early November, as things began to look worse around Moscow, Ribbentrop was certain that Hitler wanted peace. The German army had suffered no military defeats, yet they were reaching the end of their capabilities with very few reserves and a horrific supply situation. If Hitler wanted to negotiate a peace settlement from a position of strength, then now was his time. As a result of these signs from the Führer, the ambassador to the Vatican was replaced by a far more active personality who could get things done. The Germans quickly realised that the British would reject any terms they offered them, however, and it came to nothing. The Brits and the Americans instead opted to pour aid into the Soviet Union and gamble on a great reversal, which could take years. By late November, British Foreign Office instructions to ridicule any peace offensive had ended up in German hands. Irving writes of Hitler's dilemma, quote, "Hitler was on the horns of a dilemma. He had postponed his assault on the main Caucasus oil fields until 1942. By that time they would probably have been destroyed, but he still showed a curious optimism. Holder wrote, all in all, he gave an impression of anticipating that when both warring parties realise that they are incapable of destroying each other, there will result a negotiated peace. It was the vision of a second Verdun that kept recurring to Hitler, and the condescending notion that since Stalin had fought well and fearlessly, he should be spared the fate he no doubt otherwise deserved. There was an odd echo of this attitude in Hitler's remarks to his munitions minister, Fritz Todt, who returned from a tour of the Russian front on November the 29th, 1941, and summed up his prognosis thus: "Given the arms and industrial supremacy of the Anglo-Saxon powers, we can no longer militarily win this war." Hitler calmly inquired, "How am I supposed to end it then? I can't see much possibility of ending it politically." End quote. There was another issue too. The United States had for months now been openly attacking German U-boats so that Roosevelt could cry foul upon retaliation. Effectively, he was trying to bait Hitler into a war. The Japanese, too, were receiving similar treatment, and talks between the two nations had just broken down. The Japanese began to press Hitler for a solid stance regarding the US. Eventually, Hitler, via Ribbentrop, relented that if he did not back Japan, then the entire Tripartite Pact would basically fall apart. Hitler would say to doubters, quote, "The Americans are already shooting at us, so we are already at war with them." End quote. War with the Americans was the last thing Hitler wanted, but he did see it as inevitable. He was also at the gates of Moscow, so he had reason to believe that without the Soviets, a war against the Brits and the Americans alone wouldn't be the most insurmountable task, given that Britain had no foothold on the continent. Ribbentrop cabled his man in Tokyo, quote, "Our view is that the Axis powers in Japan regard themselves as locked in one historic struggle." End quote. Meanwhile, out east, things continued to take a turn for the worst. Winter clothing did finally begin to arrive, but it was effectively useless against the bitterly cold Russian winter. Meanwhile, supplies were still dreadful. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army was meant to get 18 supply trains a day, but instead were getting 3. Each army on the Leningrad front was meant to get around 17, whilst instead they were lucky if they got 1. Things were bad on both sides on this front. In Leningrad, there were even reports of German corpses being eaten by starving Soviet troops. Meanwhile in the south, Hitler had a bitter pill to swallow, as his armies had been unable to hold on to Rostov-on-Don. Marshal Timoshenko reported gleefully in a secret speech to the Supreme Defense Council in Moscow, quote, "If Germany succeeds in taking Moscow, that is obviously a grave disappointment for us. but it by no means disrupts our grand strategy. The only thing that matters is oil. As we remember, Germany kept harping on her own urgent oil problems in her economic bargaining with us from 1939 to 1941, so we have to do all we can, A, to make Germany increase her oil consumption, and B, to keep the German armies out of the Caucasus." End quote. Hitler's original strategy turned out to have been the correct one. He had been cajoled into the grand push towards Moscow by the General Staff, and in the end, neither the oil nor the capital was captured. Many thought Hitler didn't even realise quite how bad things were in Moscow. The General Staff, as if to try and hide their own failure, were not giving Hitler the complete picture. Guderian reported bitterly, quote, "We must face the melancholy fact that our superior command has overreached itself. It didn't want to believe our reports on the dwindling combat strength of our troops. It made one fresh demand after another. It made no provision for the harsh winter, and now it's been taken by surprise by the Russian temperatures of minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. We in the army have to put up with horrifying bungling and aimlessness." End quote. The Germans were, however, essentially right at the gates. On the 2nd of December, fighting in snowstorms and blizzards, a recon battalion reached Khimki on the outskirts of Moscow, but was repulsed by armed workers. Within a few days, the temperatures were at minus 35 degrees, and the Germans' tank turrets were literally frozen stiff, and their artillery wouldn't fire. This was no condition to besiege a capital. On the 5th, the Soviets launched their gigantic counterattack north of Moscow. The Russians, with their special winter oils and their masses of T-34 tanks, began to brush off the weak German resistance with ease. The Germans' standard anti-tank shell couldn't even pierce these ever-reliable tanks. The rout was ridiculous. 1,100 horses died per day. If a casualty wasn't dragged to cover within 30 minutes, they would die of exposure. One corps on the 9th reported 1,500 cases of frostbite with them alone. A German officer describes the chaos. Quote, "In wave after wave of densely packed soldiers, the enemy offensive rolled across the snowscape towards us. Our machine guns hammered away at them without let up. You could not hear yourself speak. Like a dark and somber carpet, a layer of dead and dying stretched across the snow in front of us, but still the masses of humanity came on at us, closer and closer, seemingly inexhaustible. Only when they came within hand grenade range of us did the last of these attacking Russians fall to our machine guns. And then, as our gunners began to breathe again, there was a fresh stir in the distance, a broad dark line on the horizon, and it began again." End quote. The Soviets seemed to have both infinite manpower and infinite resources. On the 6th of December, Field Marshal von Brauchitsch buckled under the pressure and resigned. Hitler was then urged to become his own commander-in-chief of the army. The very next day, Otto Dietrich, Hitler's press chief, came bursting into the room waving a piece of paper. It was a report from Reuters announcing that the Japanese had launched an airstrike on the US fleet at Pearl Harbor. Hitler shouted joyously, quote, "The turning point," end quote. He turned to Walter Huell and announced, quote, "Now it is impossible for us to lose the war. Now we have an ally who has never been vanquished in 3,000 years, and another ally who has constantly been vanquished, but has always ended up on the right side." End quote. The orders were then issued to the Navy that German submarines and warships were free to open fire on American ships as they saw fit. The Führer then headed off to Berlin, where war was officially declared just after 2 p.m. on the 11th. Hitler proudly stated that Roosevelt now had the war he'd been desperately trying to bring about. Hitler had a habit of coping though, and this was no different. A war with the US was hardly ideal right now. On the 12th, he admitted to the Gauleiters that he had spent several sleepless nights trying to decide whether or not to declare war on the US. He remarked, quote, "I never wanted things to turn out like this. Now they will lose Singapore," end quote. When he returned to the Wolf's Lair, he spoke in a similar vein to Huell, quote, "How strange that with Japan's aid, we are destroying the positions of the white race in the Far East, and that Britain is fighting against Europe with those swine, the Bolsheviks," end quote. Hitler was now officially in charge in the East. The generals saw a long withdrawal as their only salvation. Hitler, however, had other ideas. He began to ruthlessly dismiss defeatists and urged his men on to persevere through pure willpower. He would later recall, quote, "I had to act ruthlessly. I had to send even my closest generals packing. 2 army generals, for example, whose strength was gone and who were at the end of their tether. In winter, one of them came and announced, 'Mein Führer, we can't hold on any longer. We've got to retreat.' I asked him, 'Sir, where in God's name are you thinking of retreating to? How far?' 'Well,' he answered, 'I don't really know. Do you plan to drop back 30 miles? Do you think it isn't all that cold there then? And do you imagine your transport and supply problems will be any better there? And if you retreat, do you intend to take your heavy weapons with you? Can you take them?' This man answered, 'No, it can't be done.' 'So you're planning to leave them to the Russians? "And how do you think you're going to fight further back if you haven't got any heavy weapons?" He responded, "Mein Führer, save at least the army, whatever happens to its guns." So I inquired, "Are you planning just to retreat to the Reich frontier, or what? Where do you plan to call a halt?" "Well, Mein Führer," he rejoiced, "we probably won't get any choice." I could only tell these gentlemen, get yourself back to Germany as rapidly as you can, but leave the army in my charge, and the army is staying at the front." End quote. There was now a 30-mile wide gap between von Kluge and Guderian's armies. Hordes and hordes of Russians began to pour deep into the gap, and the horrifying fear of captivity seemed to grip most of the German army as they began to flee for their lives. Guderian would remark on the 10th of December, quote, "We have seriously underestimated the enemy, the size of his country, and the vagaries of the climate, and now we're paying for it." End quote. Hitler was doing all he could to stop the rout. He ordered what little reserves there were back in Germany to stop their training and get to the front. 4.5 divisions were to be raised and equipped with skis and winter clothing. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Lieb of Army Group North was asking permission to pull back as well. Hitler by this point had had enough. On the 15th he drafted the infamous Halt order, quote, "Any large-scale retreat by major sections of the army in midwinter, given only limited mobility, insufficient winter equipment, and no prepared positions in the rear, must inevitably have the gravest consequences." End quote. On the 16th, Hitler was giving the order over the telephone to von Bock. On the same day, Hitler confided to Goebbels that he was planning to replace all 3 army group commanders. They all magically had stomach problems, he joked. Guderian, still in the thick of it, wrote, quote, "Heaven knows how we're going to extricate ourselves. I'm just glad that the Führer at least knows what's happening, and I hope he'll come to grips with his customary verve with the bureaucratic wheels of the War Department, railroad and other machinery. I lay awake at night racking my brain about how I can help my poor men, who have no protection against this fierce winter weather." End quote. Hitler was telephoning von Bock, whose 267th Infantry Division had just abandoned its entire artillery in the retreat. Quote, "In this situation there is only one answer, and that is not to yield an inch, to plug the gaps and hold on." End quote. Amidst the chaos, many generals tried to settle personal scores. One of the victims was Guderian, whom was doing his very best. It had dawned on his superiors that he could no longer hold on, and he was planning a retreat, and the generals at Hitler's headquarters tried to secure his dismissal. Guderian dramatically headed to Hitler's headquarters himself and explained that his troops were exhausted and outnumbered, and that it was physically impossible to dig in, as the ground was frozen solid. Hitler simply did not understand their conditions on the ground. Hitler replied, quote, "Then use your heavy artillery or mortars to blast out craters and install trench heaters in them." End quote. He continued on, quote, "Do you believe that Frederick the Great's grenadiers enjoyed dying for their country either?" End quote. Guderian, for his part, suggested that it was time for Hitler to be rid of chair-bound generals like Keitel, Jodl, and Halder, who had never even seen the front line they were making decisions about. On Christmas Day, Kluge threw a fit and refused to work with Guderian any longer, and declared that unless Guderian was relieved of command, he would resign. Hitler was left with no choice, and Guderian, perhaps the most impressive panzer leader of all, both in the West and the East so far, was dismissed for his Herculean efforts. Christmas that year was depressing. Hitler was simply too busy. Back in Berlin there was plenty of Christmas cheer to go around, yet not here. Huell wrote, quote, "A dispirited Christmas. Führer's thoughts are elsewhere. No candles lit." End quote. Irving writes, quote, "Having assumed command of the German army, Hitler was buried by an avalanche of work. For weeks on end he knew no regular routine. The tea party in the bunker now never started before midnight. Once that winter it started after 2 a.m, which meant that his weary partners were unable to retire to bed before 4 or 5, end quote. Canaris writes of the situation around Christmas in his diary too. Quote, "December the 24th, 1941. General Schmund is drawing comparisons with 1812 and talks of the moment of truth for National Socialism. The equipment losses are horrifying. Trucks, guns, and aircraft have to be destroyed or abandoned because we lack the fuel to bring them back. All this has a grim effect on our soldiers' fighting morale as they suddenly realise that they are being badly led, and have befallen those who are by no means blameless, whatever people may say about them. Our own treatment of Russian prisoners is having awful consequences. In the retreat from Moscow, we've had to abandon German field hospitals as well. The Russians dragged out the sick and injured, hanged them upside down, poured gasoline over them, and set them on fire. On another occasion, German prisoners were beheaded, and their heads laid out to form the SS symbol." End quote. The spirit of utter defeatism and collapse ran deep. Hitler himself was even observing that they may have to pull back to the Dnieper River, or even the Polish frontier. Hitler remarked to von Kluge that back in Flanders in the Great War, he and his comrades had stood firm for 10 days against ceaseless bombardments, yet held firm. Kluge remarked that Hitler hadn't been fighting in minus 25 degrees. This situation was quite a different animal altogether than the Great War. Irving writes of New Year's Eve 1941, and thus the end of this video, quote, "None of Hitler's staff would forget the New Year's Eve that followed. Throughout the day, Kluge had been on the phone to General Halder. begging for permission to withdraw. Hitler flatly refused. Any strategic retreat was bound to touch off a general collapse. He demanded a fight to the finish in order to win time until the reinforcements arrived. Supper was again served late. Hitler dozed off afterward, exhausted, whilst the last minutes of the old year ticked away. His staff gathered expectantly in the mess and waited for him, but at 11:30, Cluj phoned urgently from the front, and for the next 3 hours, the time is graven in the diaries of Bormann, Huel, and the army group itself. Hitler wrangled with the field marshal, arguing and cajoling on the need to stand fast. Hitler refused outright to grant Cluj freedom to withdraw what amounted to a 90-mile section of the front, over 20 miles. Not until 2:30 a.m. did Hitler arrive for tea with his intimate staff. "I am glad I know how to overcome even the greatest difficulties," he said. "Let's hope 1942 brings as much good fortune as 1941. The worries can stay." So far, the pattern has always been this: the hardest times come first, as a kind of preparation for the really great events. End quote. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did make it this far, then please do leave a like on the video, it helps immensely. Next time we will of course be covering 1942, and we shall see how Adolf Hitler dealt with the triumphs and tragedies of that year in Russia and North Africa. And of course, before I end this video, the biggest thank you of all goes to my Patreon, Subscribe Star, and YouTube members who make these videos possible. Thank you to Lobster to You, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Berglund, Levi E, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, Chef Jeff, Ethan Winstanley, Wunderwaffe, Mr. Bloom, Gav D, Guys Longanese Hanno, JD, Green Rebel, Angus Roxburgh, Rocksacker Too Heavy, Alexios Podcast Watcher, Citadel, Haste, Bojan M, Rick Me, Mr. Gaming, Cameron, Sludwig 1919, Gloomy, Troy Harser, Jagdkampf, Rowan, Swedish Chef, Honda, Mirko, David Byers, Max Anton, Gragas, Conqueror, Espen, Khan, Luca Marincic, Veritas Unleashed, The Real G, Joel, Ghost 0128, Jack, Bobby Atkinson, John DeGrief, Ward, Crankless, Dramatic Equation, Russ Hale, Senator Armstrong, Lucas Drury, Mark Smith, Shameful Display, Sneed Seed and Feed, Bruno, Emma Magishmael, William S. Ozymandias, Sword Dog, Aussie Ones, Prada, Aussie Zuma, Joe Ford, Jive Ginseng, Mr. Toad, Leigh Agnew, Carolyn J, Alex D, Violently Normal, Brendan Stout, K. Reich, Unlikely Balmer, Enclave, Welcome to Kali Yuga, The Alt Vault, Justin F, Lane Perkins, King Fried Chicken, Rene Malmgren, Gianni Rabati, Panzer Jim, Aopa Ahola, Laudel, Hans, Chris, Jordan Troy, Jihad Gandalf, Eiffel, Lucas Leixenring, The Hog Shotgun, Bjorn Richter, Grady Peters, Patrick Finn, Nemesis 88, Mike and Johnny Secret Pod, Emil Flinch, Panzer Wagenlied, Rand Atlas 1902, Dustin Stratton, Tyler Yoshida, What Next, Hans Haber, Pax Tibi Marseille, Zuma Historian is the Best, Pat Mike, Genos Weiss, Ace Gunner, Martin Harkinson, John Sonkerly, Scar, Chronic Military Collector, Jan Kalivoda, Herwig Holger, Toons Tierney, Gerald Lorenz, Devin Lay, Henry Ramdas Jr., Adam Croucher, Melvin Cade, Pooper, Ooga Booga, Colin Maloney, Zarn, North, Ibby, Avery Moller, Varangian Guard, Kirk Weaver, Hendrik Mueller, John Shelton, Surfer Dude, It's Okay to be a Nationalist, Inflection Point, Vet Exempt, Automat 762X39, Monsoir Mercier, Charlie Black, Will from Florida, History by Grayscale, Friendly Fash, Jonathan S. Marinsky, Demetrius Laquan Fauci, Christian, The Waller, Suma Klubayek, Jorgen 1997, Admiral Kempinski, Carl Jung, James Ferris, Ana Paula Gomez Coelho, Pavementer 86, Kurt Linde, The Glorious Lion, Omega, Kirk Panzer, Final, Son of Tiamat, Luke, and Shifty Sheriff 2.